Previously on the Six Eye Sun Show. I'm not sure I care to do a deep dive into every work, original or parody, that 4chan has exported, but I do know that they're at least batting 1 for 1 in terms of visual novel projects. If you're too young to remember Katawa Shoujo, which, oh god, is actually a possibility now, it was a visual novel produced entirely by a team from 4chan that was inspired by mock-up art from an artist called Raita, about a hypothetical eroge where the romance options were all women with different disabilities. A few people saw this art, saw a place in the internet where an eroge featuring disabled women wasn't, and they collectively said no, this will not do. And it was for this sentiment that development started. The game had a protracted release date as a consequence of the unorthodox nature of the team working on it, but it eventually saw release in 2012, roughly 5 years after the assembly of the development team, and 3 after the release of a demo that showed off the whole of Act 1. Now, if you've been online for more than about a year, you'd probably hear the words 4chan produced visual novel about disability and see every possible avenue for the most horrible crap imaginable. But you'd be pleasantly surprised to hear that every route of this visual novel is handled with respect for the characters and for their situations. The prevailing sentiment at the time was that if you wanted to play for one reason, you'd usually leave a little different from how you entered it. And I love a good bait and switch. Katawa Shoujo was very well received, and for years afterwards it had a dedicated thread on 4chan where people discussed their experiences with the game. It continues to enjoy a cult following outside the 4chan stratum to this very day. I was close to this game, and I followed its development up until its final release as a younger, slightly less hairy lad, and I savored it over the course of a month afterwards. It stuck with me for years after that, and I probably have it to thank for engendering the love of visual novels that I have to this day. I guess for that reason, and among others, I've had the idea of discussing it at length stuck in my craw for years now. Waylaid by a lack of finance, savvy of an access to video editing software, simple doubt that I could articulate the way things stuck with me, and the concern that there are others out there who could just do it better. Time passed as it so wont to do, and I eventually got a few dollars to my name, access to video editing software, and the conviction that I want to do this before I feel like it's too late. As for the concern that there are others out there who could do it better, well, to paraphrase the Rifleman's Creed, there may be many others like it, but this one is mine. I am Six Eye Sun, and this is the prologue of my Katawa Shoujo retrospective. I hit a bit of an impasse when it came to writing the script for this video. If you find yourself watching this now, there's a non-zero chance you may have seen a review I worked on before where I did a brief summary of the opening notes of a visual novel called Snoot Game for people who needed to be sold on it. My intention going into this one was to do a more broad strokes approach to the first part of the Katawa Shoujo experience. I don't think it's averse to the truth to say that Katawa Shoujo is a more elaborate beast than Snoot Game in terms of its narrative and execution, and it comes out of the gate pretty fast about this by comparison. I mentioned that Snoot Game was interesting in the respect that your choices have a greater impact on the two leads of the story and their relationship than anything else. The narrative otherwise is relatively consistent up until the third act. Katawa Shoujo is much like a traditional visual novel in that the choices you make have more immediate and quantifiable consequences, and I had a brief argument with myself where I found myself torn between giving a more laconic summary of its first act, or if I should attempt to explore it with a similar degree of thoroughness to my summary of Snoot Game's first act. There are quite a few more branching paths in the mix here, so suffice it to say it would be a bit more of an arduous task on my part. So I did what no one in their right mind should ever do, and take my anxieties to Twitter. And while I believe the sample size of a survey I did to figure out my approach was relatively skewed, I am when the chips are down a man of the people. So here's my compromise. I'll try to be a little bit more giving than I would have been about the prologue, while still attempting to hold fast to my ultimate goals of not subtracting from time we could spend on more nuanced character analysis in future videos, and preserving the experience for people who haven't played Katawa Shoujo before. Because even if they've had over 10 years to give their balls a tug and play the damn thing, the very last thing I want to do is spoil the game for people who haven't had a chance to experience it for themselves yet. I think if you found yourself clicking on this video, there's a darn good chance I don't have anything to worry about on that front. But I might be wrong, and if I am talking directly into your ear now. You should go download this game and play it immediately, because if you'll permit me to cut the foreplay for a hot second, this visual novel is fucking great. The characters jump off the page, the writing is very well executed, the soundtrack is awesome, and I didn't mention it previously, but you can get the whole game for free right now. And shit, you know, the second best expenditure of your time doesn't cost anything would most likely be...
Oh yeah, baby, don't stop. Oh, my fucking god. Yeah.
One last thing before I get the ball rolling. With some very notable exceptions, when I'm in situations where I have to give a grassroots summary of a visual novel, I will be filtering them through the lens of a follow my heart run, picking options that I would do given the situation and the context. because even if it hamstrings me in certain capacities, I think that it's the most effective and authentic way to talk about my unique experiences with a work of this nature. This will cause me to miss some things and be locked out of the loop with others, but rest assured, on the future videos I'm planning about Katawa Shoujo, I will address parts of the prologue that I may have missed because of my adherence to this rule when it's relevant for me to do so. Now, I think I've set the stage sufficiently for this video's raison d'etre, so without any further ado, let's get into it. If you're coming at this totally fresh to Katawa Shoujo, the jag goes something like this. You're high school senior Hisao Nakai, and you're responding to a letter sent to you by the girl of your dreams. She's confessing her love, and you're so overwhelmed your heart feels like it could just burst. And then it does. You survive a myocardial infarction, but you have a protracted recovery in hospital, during which you're slowly abandoned by all your friends. The girl who talked to you on that fateful day visits every day, then every other day, and then once a week, before she too is in the rearview mirror of your life. Soccer games turn to jaunts at the library. The days turn into white noise. Eventually, you have a talk with your parents and a doctor, and they give you word that you will not be able to resume normal schooling, which may be just as well, since it's not like you're swimming in good company from your old school at the moment. But there is an alternative solution in the form of Yamaku Academy, a mountaintop school whose constituents primarily consist of students with various physical disabilities. Seeing no other recourse, you decide to transfer. Class is in session. You cross the threshold of your new life, meet eccentric homeroom teacher Akio Muto, and decide whether or not to question the point of introducing yourself to your class. I'm nothing if not accommodating, and you rarely if ever get a second chance at a strong first impression, so I'm all in. When you're brought to your class to introduce yourself, regardless of your sense of overall enthusiasm, you fall into the radar of Shizune Hakamichi and Shina Misha Mikado, president and vice president of the student government. The pair stick to you like remoras on a shark and take it upon themselves to be your liaisons into life at the school, adjusting to the ebb and flow of this new environment. They give you a tour and open the floor to certain questions you may have. You can affirm their efficiency by saying you have none, out yourself as a recently bookish type by inquiring about the library, or, if you have the self-admitted social savoir-faire of a slug, you can ask about Shizune's deafness. From there, you get a first glimpse of a more withdrawn girl in your class, go to the nurse to turn your head and cough, and run into your dorm mate, Kenji, a legally blind and boorish boy who's your comedy relief in this new place. Shizune and Misha are an aggressive pair, this being exemplified by their determination to get you into the student council, a pretty big swing given that you've only been here about a day. Nonetheless, they finagle you into a game of Risk, during which Shizune has you on the ropes. You can choose to get aggressive or stay on the defense. When in doubt, I usually default to more defensive strategies, so that's what I did. Shizune will always pin you in this game, but how badly you lose will be a factor going forward. You meet Lily Sato shortly after the game while looking for the library, a beautiful blonde who's blind. You lose track of the hours talking with her over tea, and when the sun begins to set, you go to the library together. You meet that withdrawn girl in your class, one Hanako Ikazawa, sitting on a beanbag chair reading Life of Pi. Between her being startled by your recent attention and Hisao realizing she has pretty bad facial scarring, tensions appear to be a bit on the higher side compared to other introductions. You can choose to push past the static and introduce yourself, or apologize for giving her a fright. I opt for the former as I am cordial to a fault, and out of hope that a friendly introduction might help diffuse the initial awkwardness, but she dips when she gets the wrong idea about our intentions. Bully. The librarian chides us for our lack of tact, and we run into Kenji on our way back to the dorm. He asks if we would describe Hanako as cute, and as I have done every single time I have ever played this game, I tell him that she is. I'm sure this is probably some sort of flag that may make things a little bit harder than they could be. But what, would you have me say she isn't cute? Balderdash. The next day, Hisao asks Shizune and Misha about Hanako, and Misha tells him that broaching the subject with Shizune is a bad move. You're given up to 3 choices here depending on your choices so far: waiting for Shizune and Misha, reading your book, or talking to Hanako. I feel like I should talk to Hanako if only to apologize for the way I came off in the library. We share the same class, so it's not out of the question that we could be paired up for an assignment or something. We appear to have struck a chord with Hanako, and we end up departing with her and Lily when Lily arrives. On our way down the hall, we find ourselves getting shithoused by a girl who's never heard of that old adage about running in the hallways. Emi Ibarazaki, the fastest thing on no legs. Hisao is briefly charmed by her cute apologism, but doesn't have long to ponder it before his heart starts to act up. Fortunately, nothing more serious comes of it, and we go have tea with Hanako and Lily unencumbered. Hisao, uncertain about what to do after school, lingers in Muto's class and opens up about his difficulties bridging the divide between talking to students and addressing their disabilities. Misha then arrives, concerned about art supplies for setting up stands, and Muto consigns you to the idea of wresting them from the art department. You meet Rin Tezuka here, and after she accuses you of having chronic penile dysfunction, you end up getting what you need. Shizune arrives and chastises her for not having completed a mural ahead of the festival, and Hisao offers her some assistance getting some paint downstairs. You run into the nurse at this point, who voices concern that you may not be exercising as much as you should. He asks you if you'd be willing to reaffirm your commitment to your physical health, and since I figure Hisao is as committed to survival as a radical action as I am, I say that we will. With that sorted, we watch and help Rin with painting the mural, and we cut to the next morning, just as I get dangerously close to forming an opinion on neo-cubism. Emi is at the track, and we make good in our word to get some exercise in before we hit the showers. I'm very happy to see Yamaku affirming their commitment to assisting disabled students through subtle cues in its design. Ramps for wheelchairs alongside stairs, handrails placed in every hallway, and in the showers, naked people accosting you for money and ranting about crap. God bless us, everyone. Lily approaches Hisao's class to look for Hanako, but tensions between Lily and Shizune come to a head, and Misha and you end up getting roped into an argument with them about the student council. Now, Emi and Rin have a little bit more exacting criteria for embarking on their routes, but if your primary concern is trying to make something happen with Shizune, Lily, or Hanako, this is going to be a pretty huge come-to-Jesus moment for your playthrough. Shizune forces you to pick a side once and for all, and you can either stand your ground and say you've done enough for the student council, locking you out of the loop with Lily and Hanako, or you can defend yourself and Lily, moving on with her and Hanako while locking yourself out and moving forward with Shizune. And you know, even from many miles away, I can hear you ask, well, what kind of man are you then, hotshot? Who's it going to be? Well, I'll tell you, I'm a pretty laid-back guy by nature, and I like to take things at my own pace. There are a few things I detest more than feeling like I'm getting rushed into stuff, or people acting like they're entitled to my time, especially in situations where I'm not getting compensated for that time. And while I have a lot of love for Shizune for reasons I'll get into later, it's hard to deny she sort of exemplifies both those things I detest in the limited time we've known her. Shizune is nice, if a little abrasive, but Lily is nice and not abrasive, and while I enjoy being civic-minded, contributing to my community and all that, there's only so much type A personality I can take in a single day, so we're telling Shizune to lump off.
What did I say? What did you just say?
I said lump off, Mom!
With the bridge now thoroughly burnt between you and Shizune, Hisao elects to have dinner at the cafeteria with Hanako. Though it's a little awkward because of how shy she is, he leaves with a little bit more perspective on her and her relationship with Lily. You end up finding Lily doing festival prep with her homeroom class. Since her class is primarily catered towards blind students, you also happen upon Kenji here doing some work painting a banner. You and Hanako assist him, and eventually you see Lily and Hanako back to the dorms as you head back to bed yourself. You meet Emi at the track, and you're given the option to push yourself or take it easy. I like exercising as much as the next guy, but we have a heart condition and we're of no use to anyone dead, so we're going to keep it breezy. I'm going to briefly interrupt this video from the editing chair to make a quick note because it slipped my mind to mention it during my initial audio recording. If you say yes to the nurse asking you to exercise and you decide to push yourself on the track here, it will lead to you being put in the fast track to Emi's route. So if you're not sufficiently into Emi for whatever reason, you should probably follow my example and pace yourself accordingly. Normally I wouldn't mention this, but I figure pointing out narrative pit traps is kind of important to prevent ill experiences to newcomers. A big thank you to my patron, Leonator, for pointing this out where I missed it. Alright, back to the video. Hisao elects as he's finishing up running that it probably isn't for him anyway, and after a short talk with Kenji, he finds that there's no love lost between him and Emi for that decision, as she invites him onto the roof to have lunch with her and Rin, making friends with the pair. He goes to the library after this, checks out a few books, decides against talking to Hanako when he sees her there, and decides to go shopping in town for supplies, running into Lily on his way to town. They get their food and run into Rin after dark. They walk back with her, and Hisao's heart gives him a bit of trouble on the uphill slope. Lily notices this, and you're given another choice, telling her that you're not in good shape or telling her that you really don't want to talk about it. Now, I would personally choose the latter because I'm pretty insular about what I share about myself, especially if I don't think the people around me are making a similar effort. However, and consider this a PSA, if you make the rational decision to play your cards to your chest with Lily and Rin, it's a straight shot, no chaser, all the way to the bad ending. I can't say I'm crazy in love with that, especially since the internal logic is kind of hackneyed. I'm just telling them that I don't want to talk about something they're not obliged to know about in the first place. I'm not getting rabid and snapping at them. But as I cannot tell Hisao that myself, I instead say what helps to keep this party going. The three of you eventually make it back to the dorms and you see each other off. The next day follows. Muto asks Hisao after class about how he's feeling about the people around him. And that pretty much sums it up as far as Act 1 goes, for the most part. What follows is each unique time Hisao has at the festival depending on who you're most comfortable with. I'm going to be covering each festival scene along with my examination of each girl's individual route, but in the end, the connections you make and the ones you leave by the wayside will forge your path to the future you may have doubted. And maybe, if you're lucky, you'll fall in love along the way too. That being said, I think even in spite of my renewed desire for elaboration, I was relatively sparing so that players new and old could fill in the blanks with their own experiences. I should warn you that if you think I'm going to do the same with my coverage of Acts 2 through 4, you'd be mistaken. Before you see, I'm going to be spoiling this game cover to cover, route by route. Review, analysis, retrospective, you could strap on whatever title to this series you like, but I think each romance option offers a movable feast of things to discuss, so I'm going to do them all separately. I might end up releasing a big ol' monster truck style compilation of all of them eventually, but I'm not really sweating the minutia, so why should you? Look, don't worry about it, alright? That being said, I guess I should probably take the opportunity to discuss some more minor elements of the mise-en-scene of Katawa Shoujo, so I don't need to bog down more route-specific discussions to more minor observations. If something comes up in that route that permits an expansion of anything I touch on here, I'll let you know. If you survive past the prologue, and I do mean literally, you mostly focus your attention on one romance option, but we deal with Hisao through all of this, and I think he's worth taking a beat to talk about. To hear him tell it, he's enjoyed a relatively pleasant life up until his heart attack, well liked by people at his school, had the romantic interests of a girl in his class, kept in good health and stayed physically active through soccer. His parents worked jobs that kept them both out for relatively late hours, so he learned to be self-sufficient at a fairly young age. But otherwise, I'd say by any account, he enjoyed good fortune in the grand scheme until the moment he didn't. But nevertheless, the boy that entered the hospital is not the same as the one that left it. The Hisao that we see at Yamaku is pessimistic, a bit on the grouchy side, with an unpredictable temper, has little patience for the more eccentric behavior of his fellows, and feels vaguely put upon in a lot of situations where he's out of his comfort zone. I don't know if I'd want to spend more than an hour chatting with him if I were to meet him at a party or something, but he's rarely outright unpleasant to deal with. There's a proud tradition of more faceless or featureless protagonists in romantic visual novels, but I think to cast Hisao in this light is to do him a disservice. There's a couple more routes that focus attention on Hisao's development than others. Perhaps, but I think he does have a personality, and it's one that I think goes through a certain degree of permutations depending on whichever route you choose. But let's put a pin in that and circle back to it another time. Katawa Shoujo's soundtrack, Katawa Shoujo The Enigmatic Box of Sound, was done by Sebastian Nicola Malfi Scoff and Andy Blue123 Andi. And as far as soundtracks go, I think it's pretty sound. The compositions are rather simple, but the core combination of acoustic guitar and piano, with occasional accompaniment from a mellow accordion or a cheeky saxophone, contributes a lot of peaceful, cozy atmosphere to this school set in the mountains. There really aren't any extremely high-octane stakes in whichever plot you choose, and I think that the soundtrack captures the intention of a more down-to-earth romance very well. Its production value also certainly exceeded my expectations pertaining to quality that I had going into it too. I think my most damning point about the soundtrack really is that I don't think it's the kind of thing I would listen to in context divorced of its source material, but I think that speaks of how effective of a marriage it is to it. Inextricable ties don't need to be a bad thing, and although it's my aim to make a God's honest effort to discuss this visual novel from an objective standpoint, divorced of my nostalgia and prior attachment, I can't deny that I'm transplanted back to first playing this game as a younger man, every time I hear the opening notes of the main menu theme, Waiozna. So maybe it's just as well that I don't really take this music on the go with me. I'd hate to risk losing that feeling. Katawa Shoujo's art direction is pretty cool. Most of the backgrounds are taken from stock photos that are painted to match the aesthetic of the characters, which I think is a pretty thrifty trick if you're doing a project of this nature. Yamaku Academy in particular was taken from photos of Brown University, and although I mentioned it offhand and set up for a joke earlier, I think it's neat that they modified them in order to demonstrate Yamaku's attentiveness to being an accessible building. I think the sprite work is really nice too. I'm still laboring on a literal drawing board, so I don't know if I'm really equipped to speak on digital art, but I think that it's an effective emulation of the sort of sprites you'd see in visual novels released around this time period, and a solid simulacrum of something that could have been originally produced in Japanese, and I think that's a good endorsement of the art direction too. This is helped along by the fact that the game includes animated scenes between Act 1 and Act 2 for whichever route you decide to go down, done by Mikey Nell, which is a touch I did not expect them to add in my first playthrough. The CGs are also pretty solid. I think Hisao sometimes looks like he just dropped an ice cream cone, but otherwise I think the art stills that we see convey more dramatic moments nicely. There's also another reason why I think CGs are of special import, and it coincides with one reason why I'm happy my parents don't know I have a YouTube channel yet. As I mentioned earlier, Katawa Shoujo originally came about as a concept for an eroge, and this part is alive and well in the final product, if perhaps more downplayed than most would expect. I won't beat around the bush. There are indeed scenes of a sexual nature in this game, but if titillation is your primary objective, I think you might be in short supply. Sex acts in Katawa Shoujo are mostly presented in a true-to-life way, bearing in mind that the characters are, on average, about 18 years old, and nobody knocks it out of the park between the sheets that early on, unless you're like European or something. My larger point being, it's clumsy. People often use the phrase exploring each other's bodies as a euphemism, but I think in this case it's the kind of exploring where you trip on vines and shit fairly often. Some fast animals, slow children type stuff.
Oh, dang, I got
Lemon-flavored lube.
all over my legs.
If you find this distracting, you fare on the sex repulse side, or you're new to this YouTube thing and you're terrified of learning the hard way about how strict they are about depictions or descriptions of people doing it to each other, there's an option to turn these scenes off. But I usually prefer to err on the side of keeping them on when I replay this game because I think that certain age scenes add something to our understandings of different characters, even if it's something small. Sex can be a powerful thing, and maybe old age is turning me sentimental, but I think it's kind of cool that Katawa Shoujo, at least in its final release, tends to lean towards treating these exchanges of physical intimacy with a certain degree of gravity, at least when it isn't awkward in a way that suits the ages and experience levels of the people involved. I think that should be about it as far as stuff to talk about that could subtract valuable time from more character-focused analysis. I don't know, I try to convey the general shape of each character, sort of like required reading before we dig deeper into them as character studies and as shoujo trope deconstructions. But I think even despite my best efforts, I might not have struck a very good balance, because ultimately, I think to describe the characters in a way that abstains from their larger intricacies is to do each of them a disservice, and I think diminishes the scope of what I'm trying to do here. So I think you'll either have to wait for me to get there when I get there, or play the game yourself. I count it as a victory on my part either way. I think that all of them are really great characters, and I found the narratives that accompany them to be great experiences. I guess I'm excited to re-experience them through this lens, and I hope you have some fun coming along with me as I trot along and try to explore my feelings on each route. As I believe I mentioned earlier, if I were to finish up the route we started here, I'd ultimately have to choose between going to the library and finding Hanako, or going to the festival and finding Lily. However, I have my own itinerary for how I'm going to handle this series. In true schoolyard fashion, I'm going to do so by tackling the list of girls in alphabetical order going by last name.
So let me just check my clipboard here and see who our first contestant is. This is going to be an interesting one to unpack.